two groups of members present, I declare the motion passed.
無立法效力。
Members' motion with no legislative effect. Mr. Scott Leung will move a motion on promoting the redevelopment of aged public housing estates. Mr. Hon Yang will move an amendment to the motion. This council will proceed to a joint debate on the motion and the amendment. Later, I will first call upon Mr. Scott Leung to speak and move the motion. Then I will call upon Mr. Hon Yang to speak, but he may not move the amendment at this stage. The joint debate now begins. Members who wish to speak, please press the Request to Speak button. I now call upon Mr. Scott Leung to speak and move the motion. President, I move that the motion as printed on the agenda, that is promoting the redevelopment of aged public housing estates, be passed. The Housing Authority in year 2013 has reviewed the development potential of 13 housing estates. They are now between 40 to 70 years of age. For housing estates with a redevelopment plan in line, there are only a few. I always hear complaints from residents living in aged housing estates that the living condition is poor, there are concrete spalling and water seepage, and there is potential safety risk. I have handled a case that a concrete larger than the head of a person has fallen from the kitchen all of a sudden. This is not the actual size. Actually, the concrete spalled off was larger than this. And there are houses where there are constant concrete spalling on the ceiling from the living room. When they eat, concrete would fall on their head. Now, the housing authorities' approach to address this is only adjusting the symptoms. In year 2018 to 19, the expenditure on maintenance has increased from $3.7 billion. It has increased to $4.5 billion a few years later, a 50% increase. Redevelopments would incur a lower cost, and it is important in improving the living condition of residents. Redevelopment requires a long process. At Pakin Estate, as well as Minghua building in Shaoqiwan, has gone through a very long cycle of redevelopment. It takes more than 10 years. Without a prior planning and study, the timetable will be longer, and by then, the condition of the building will be even worse. As such, this is a very pressing matter. Public housing estates are different in sizes. We need to proceed with redevelopments in an orderly manner. Now, the waiting time for the first allocation has been increased to 6 years. It is way longer than the targets intended by the government. In the policy address, the CE has set a cap on the waiting time. If we can conduct redevelopments in an orderly manner, we can increase the supply of public housing units and balance the need balance the allocation amount. Last year, the Housing Authority has conducted a study to redevelop a Matao Wai estate. In this policy address, the Chief Executive also said a study will be conducted on the redevelopment of an additional housing estate. It shows that the government has considered the redevelopment potential of housing estates. We applaud that. However, the key is that we need to have housing resources to rehouse residents affected by the redevelopment projects, especially for older housing estates. With the scarcity of land, it is very challenging, and we need to deploy new housing estate resources to rehouse affected residents. Besides PRH, the Housing Society also offers public housing and subsidized housing units to offer adequate housing to people. The government should take a macro view to encourage different organizations to launch housing projects to achieve the effect of 1+1 greater than 2. The industry has always have wide discussion on how to increase supply of housing units. Now, my organization, that is a Federation of Housing Estates, have prepared a report on redevelopment of aged public housing estates. These are the recommendations that we have come up with. First of all, we have to take into consideration the size of different housing estates to come up with a timetable. We should start with the smaller housing estates. For example, in Shek Kip Mei Chun, there are some 3,000 units. Warlock Estate in Kwun Tong has 1,900 units. In Wong Tai Sin, the estate has 1,600 units. They should be given priority in terms of redevelopment. Second, we should utilize resources from new housing estates to rehouse residents. Decanting is very important. Now, the Housing Authority adopts the principle of in situ relocation. As a result, housing estates for decanting purpose is very important. For new public housing estates constructed, they should be used for decanting purpose, so residents can remain in their network. Now, for Warlock Estates, there will be 1,800 flats delivered in year 2025. If housing estates near the old public housing estates can be used as decanting sites, in situ relocation will be possible. Third, urging different institutions to join in. The housing society has a number of housing estates requiring redevelopment. From a macro policy point of view, the government should coordinate the efforts of different housing organizations in redevelopment. For example, Ma Tau Wai Estates, Chun Sin Mei Chun, and Lokman Sun Chun under the housing society's purview. There can be a joint study to redevelop the three housing estates in an orderly manner through in situ relocation and land exchange to achieve the 1+1 greater than 2 effect. And also, there are also the Lei Mok 2 estates, Cheung San estates, and Moon Lock building, and so on. And Warlock Dai Ha. In terms of urban renewal, we should consider the need for redevelopment of old housing estates. There should be a clawback mechanism so that lands created from urban renewal projects can be used for building new housing estates and decanting residents affected by redevelopment projects. In the middle to long term, redevelopment of housing estates would affect the supply of housing estates. However, according to our estimation, with the redevelopment of the 14 housing estates, with greater development intensity, and there will be an extra 36,000 yield of housing units. For example, in year 2017, the Meidong and Maple houses were redeveloped, involving some 360 housing units. It is estimated that after in situ redevelopment in year 2027 and 28, there will be 2,900 housing units with 4 times yield of housing units. It shows that redevelopment of old housing units will help increasing housing supply, thus achieving the targets of the long-term housing strategy. From the perspective of enhancing residents' living condition, it will be very beneficial, and also redevelopment can enhance the quantity of housing units provided. I shall submit. Thank you.
Mr. Yang Wing-kit, I now put a question to you that the motion moved by Mr. Man-kwong be passed. Mr. Yang Wing-kit, Madam Deputy, I thank Mr. Man-kwong for sponsoring this motion on promoting the redevelopment of aged public housing estates. My amendment involves not just the housing authority but the housing society as well. And I propose a land replacement option with a long history of public housing in Hong Kong. Some of them are over close to 70 years old. Now, there are 9 PRH estates that are very old, and for the housing society, they have some that are very old. Man-kwong estate is 60 years old, and Sunshine May estate 57 years old, and Lokman, where I've served for more than a decade, Lokman Sunshine is already 50 years old. I've received complaints from many residents, spoiling of concrete and water seepage and failing concrete, etc. And then after repair, they will come back to plague the residents, and it's also very expensive. In the past 10 years, the cost in maintenance grew from $2.4 billion to $3.98 billion, up 60%. Now, if we do not deal with the situation, we're going to spend more and more on repair and maintenance. We can't improve the quality of life for our residents, and yet we continue to spend money on repairs, and that is pouring water down the drains. Now, in 2013, 22 old housing estates were considered to be suitable for rehousing, but we've only got timetable for a few of them. In 2018, the policy address proposed redeveloping Sunshine May Estate, and 2021, Man-kwong Estate. Guy Fong, 19 years old, said to me once that he was not sure whether he could live long enough for redevelopment. Now, the Housing Authority use of 4 so-called principles, and at the end of the day, it will say it will consider the actual circumstances to see whether redevelopment is going to work. In fact, they only look at the cost effectiveness in 2020. In fact, we can redevelop healthy village, healthy estate for decanting. I think the intention or the belief, the conviction behind is not to take up flats for allocation to those on PRH. Now, the CE has recently put a cap to the waiting time for PRH from 6 years to 4.5 years. I understand that the government is under pressure to clear the backlog of waiting lists, but then take Man-kwong Estate, Wafu Estate as example. After redevelopment, the number of flats can more than double, and Sunshine May Estate and Man-kwong Estate, because of relaxation in height restriction after relocation of the airport. According to HA and HS, after redevelopment, number of flats can increase by 60 to 70% respectively. Now, if HA redevelop all 14 old housing estates, at least 36,000 more units can be provided, not to mention the extra units that can be provided by other redevelopment projects. So if we redevelop old estates, we can improve the quality of life for members of the public and provide more flats. I am with Mr. Man-kwong on this issue. The government should map out a timetable as soon as possible, and new housing estates should be used for decanting. And HS and HA should collaborate in redevelopment. The government should adopt a high level of planning so that the two organizations can collaborate and have synergies. As I said in my amendment, there should be this land replacement option. URA reactivated the redevelopment project of Sunshine May Street, and there are 2 housing estates nearby, namely Lokman and Sunshine May. The URA should take the initiative to approach HS and HA so that there can be a comprehensive project to redevelop all 3 estates. And then the roads, the fire station, and the schools and the government complex should be rezoned and replanted to increase the supply of flats. And then the cooperative housing scheme for civil service at Man-kwong Road should also be resumed. and then the plot ratio can be taken up by URA to enhance the effectiveness. I hope members can support my motion.
Secretary for Housing. Madam Deputy, I thank Mr. Man-kwong for moving the motion, and I also thank Mr. Yang Wing-kit for moving an amendment. The motion is on promoting the redevelopment of aged public housing estates. I would like to give a reply now. After I've heard members' speeches, I will give another response. All along, the Housing Authority HA has been conducting regular assessments on aged public housing estates to ensure that they are safe and fit for use. The HA considers the actual circumstances and, based on 4 principles, namely structural condition of buildings, cost-effectiveness of repair work, availability of rehousing resources in the vicinity, and build-back potential, before deciding in a prudent manner whether to redevelop individual estates. Based on the above policy and principles, in fact, in the past 10 years, that is 2012-13 to 2021-22, the HA has completed 13 redevelopment projects that involves 6 public housing estates and 3 factory buildings, clearing a total of 23,000 residential units and 3,400 factory units. Upon redevelopment, 19,900 units are provided. Currently, the HA is engaged in 10 redevelopment projects that are in progress or planned, including the older portion of Pak Tin Estate, the older portion of Man-kwong Estate, Shackley Interim Housing, Wafu Estate, Saiwan Estate, Matawai Estate, Yip On Factory Estate, Su Fai Factory Estate, Wang Chang Factory Estate, and Kwai On Factory Estate. The 10 projects would clear 17,000 residential units and 4,800 factory units. It will produce 32,000 residential units. We would like to make it clear that redevelopment increases supply of public housing in the long run. However, some projects may reduce the number of units provided as a whole. For instance, the Lower Ngau Tau Kok Estate would see a drop in number of units after redevelopment, a drop by about 55%. The reason is that part of the land has to be returned to the government for the provision of open space and the East Kowloon Cultural Center to meet the needs of the area. Where resources allow, the HA would, as far as possible, make use of suitable rehousing resources in the vicinity for rehousing tenants affected by the estate clearance. As a large number of newly built public housing units is used for rehousing households affected by the redevelopment, the number of units available for allocation to applicants on the waiting list will be reduced. Given the current acute demand on public housing, large-scale redevelopment will take up public housing units which will otherwise be allocated to applicants with a more pressing need, for example, those living in inadequate housing. We think this would have an adverse impact on these households. We think that the housing need of those on the waiting list outweighs those who are already living in public housing. We need to consider the pressing need of households on the waiting list and strike a balance when we make long-term plans. We will consider the redevelopment of individual estates in an orderly manner as far as practicable. The HA is working with government departments to identify suitable land and study how to use land in an optimal way. They are also examining the feasibility of building public housing on vacant land in or near existing estates. If these buildings could be used as rehousing resources for redevelopment, the HA will consider its use based on the above 4 principles. Regarding structural condition of buildings, the structure of aged public housing estates of the HA is sound. There is no urgent need in this regard for redevelopment. The HA is using resources they have to implement the 10 redevelopment projects. In view of public expectations for a faster pace of redevelopment, the 2022 policy address suggested that the HA conduct a redevelopment study on one more public housing estate. The HA will, based on the policies and principles outlined above, consider which estate is to be redeveloped. It's expected that an announcement will be made in mid-2023. For estates not under any redevelopment plan, the HA will continue with various plans to maintain and improve the condition of the buildings in order to provide a safe and suitable environment for residents to live in. Under the Comprehensive Structural Investigation Program, the HA conducts an assessment on public housing estates over 40 years old once every 15 years. The work includes assessment of overall structural safety of the buildings, on-site investigation and tests, assessment on strength of concrete and condition of steel bars, as well as repair plans and their cost effectiveness. Buildings deemed to be safe and cost-effective for repair are sustained for at least 15 years. For estates over 40 years old but are assessed to be sustainable, the HA will carry out necessary structural repair work. Under the total maintenance scheme, the HA will proactively inspect the internal condition of the units and carry out repair work to improve the living environment for the residents. The scheme enhances the economic benefit and lengthens the lifespan of its assets. The HA also implements the Estate Improvement Program and the Lift Modernization Program to maintain and repair buildings and facilities of public housing estates. The government has been in close contact with the Housing Society, DHS. Where land resources is available, land is granted to the HS to commence redevelopment of its estates. For example, the government has granted land in Shapai Wan Road to start the redevelopment of Man-kwong and granted land in Onting Street for the redevelopment of Chun Sin Mei Estate. Kwong, the Ting On Estate, the Ting On Street for Kun Tong Fa Yun building, and a piece of land in Kai Tak for the redevelopment of Chun Sin Mei Chun. The HS will use the original site of Chun Sin Mei Chun to commence the redevelopment of Lok Man San Chun by phases. The HS estimates that there are available units in Kai Tak for rehousing residents affected by government development plans or URA projects. This will help speed up redevelopment of all area. As stated in the policy address, the government will work closely with the HA and the HS to increase quantity, speed, efficiency, and quality in housing supply in order to shorten the waiting time for public housing as to continuously improve the living condition of residents.
Mr. Dominic Lee, thank you, President. As early as in 2013, the HA already completed a study of redevelopment of 12 old housing estates, but it has been 9 years, but only 3 have been redeveloped. For the rest, not even a timetable has been made. Now, many old housing estates are aged and they have safety hazards. To redevelop these new old estates, we can boost the infrastructure and we can plan the urban environment and increase flat supply. I thank Mr. Man-kwong for sponsoring this motion so that we can have an opportunity to discuss this matter. The New People's Party support the motion. Many old housing estates have got a concrete sprawling from ceiling, exposed, reinforced steel, and also water seepage. Now, I used to work with Mr. Man-kwong in Samshipo, and you once asked Oriental Daily to go and see for themselves. And then on the first floor of Washington House of Alpha Estate, there was concrete spalling, and then a female security guard was hit on her head. And then an elderly lady who lives in an old PRH flat suffered problems of concrete spalling, and when she was cooking once, she was hit in her head, and the condition of the flat was so bad that it was not really fit for human consumption. The management office always promised to carry out a few days of repair work. This is outrageous because tinkering with these old housing estates is useless. We have yet to unleash the potential of many old housing estates. We can raise the plot ratio in new housing estates to resolve this problem. Now, for Choi Hong Estate, which has also suffered concrete sprawling, and the flats are only 20 stories tall, whereas Kai Ching Estate and nearby resident estates, they are over 30 stories tall. So if we expedite redevelopment, we can provide more flats for allocation. We all understand that when we redevelop old housing estates, in the short term, that may affect the supply of flats. But for a long time, rehousing is always done in phases. Take Choi Hong Estate as example. The Housing Authority can first redevelop 2 blocks, providing about 1,500 flats, and residents can be decanted to a PRH estate in Wang Chiu Road, and then another block can be built to decant the remaining residents. So phase 2 can start. If we use a phased redevelopment, then we can freeze fewer new flats for allocation, and rehousing in situ can also be feasible. In the medium term, we can see tens of thousands of new flats supplied, and we can unleash land potential, and we can improve the living environment of residents in old housing estates. And in one go, we can address problems such as transport and lack of infrastructure, etc. So it's a pressing task for us to redevelop old housing estates. Hopefully, the motion can be passed and the government can adopt our proposals. Thank you. Mr. Chow Man-kwong. Now, the waiting time and also living conditions of PRH have been criticized. According to statistics, in 2022, there are 250,000 flats over 36 years old, and some of them are over 60 years old, involving 29,000 units. And in Hong Kong, Kowloon, and NT, Pak Tin Estate, Mei Tung Estate, and Wai Fu Estate are being planned for redevelopment, and for the remaining old housing estates, they are just repaired and maintained. Now, I think these can be potential hazards for the city. The older the housing estates get, the greater the risks. We should improve the living environment of our people. Presidency said that we must earnestly address the difficulties and livelihood issues. So I support Mr. Man-kwong's original motion and the amendment as well. Whether we are just patching up the problems or otherwise, we are not resolving the problem. In 2021-22, HA spent $4.2 billion on repair and maintenance, up 30% compared with 2015-16, when the figure was $3.1 billion, and the money could be spent on building another housing estate. So in the long run, I think we will harm the physical health of the HA. Spending on repair and maintenance a year can foot the bill for building one new estate because Seoul only costs $5 billion to build. So we must have a timetable and roadmap for redeveloping old housing estates to improve the living environment of residents and to increase flat supply in the long run. The government has activated the advanced planning of redevelopment of housing estates. However, the speed lags behind the aging of these housing estates. In 2018, there was two comprehensive structural investigation programs. The first phase took 13 years, and for phase 2, it's expected that it can only be completed in 2032. It has completed a surveying of 50 old housing estates, but only 3 of them are on the drawing board for redevelopment. I think more and more housing estates will age, and yet redevelopment is not coming at all. So we must have a timetable and roadmap for redevelopment. We must deal with smaller housing estates where decanting is easier. And take Walong as example is very old and it should be given priority. It's important that we make good use of land resources because land is scarce in Hong Kong. We should maximize the plot ratio of a site so that we can increase PRH supply. For instance, the Federation of PHEs said that Walok Estate has a plot ratio of 7.5%. There are 8 blocks with 7 stories only, and there is still room for building taller blocks. Wafu Estate and Saiwan Estate among the 5 that are to be redeveloped, and another 10,000 units can be provided. In the past, it was suggested that green farm subsidized housing be built in a space in between housing estates. Now we should use existing resources to rehouse residents that may lengthen the waiting time for PRH. However, the policy address has said that we must use MIC for flat construction to increase the efficiency and quality of rehousing. That being the case, soon, the authorities urge the construction sector to do this as soon as possible, and there should at least be 3 plots for fabrication, for on-site prefabrication, and we must ensure stable supply of manpower to HA. There should be incentives to retain manpower so that these schemes can go ahead. Thank you.
Mr. Chen Hopong. Madam Deputy, in this year's policy address, the CE has offered many new measures to increase the housing supply, including light public housing and also capping the waiting time for PRH. These are good measures. However, for residents living in old housing estates, besides the promise that another old public housing estates would be selected for redevelopment, and there are no new hubs. In terms of public housing estates redevelopment, I think we all remember the 4 principles offered by the Housing Authority. That is the condition, structural condition, the cost effectiveness, whether alternative resources are available, and also potential for in situ rehousing. As the chair of the Housing Authority, I hope you can revisit the 4 principles. For structural condition, every 15 years, a new cycle of comprehensive structural investigation program would begin, and then there will be full comprehensive maintenance. However, for older buildings, they age more quickly. For private buildings, structural investigation is needed is required every 10 years. But for public housing buildings, the cycle is 15 years. Besides the comprehensive investigation, there is also the total maintenance program. However, the reach-out rate and the quality of the maintenance have been criticized. The Audit Commission and also the media has criticized the lack of comprehensiveness of the total maintenance scheme. More importantly, when there are structural issues, there is no maintenance that can help. For some buildings, the sewage pipes are installed in the flats, and when there is an epidemic, it would cause a health risk. And also, some floors are not served by elevators. And sometimes for some units, the ventilation vents is facing the corridor, and it causes a privacy concern. Of course, maintenance incur lower costs, but we are sacrificing the living standard of our residents, and we are sweeping the problems under the carpet. Well, lack of resources for decanting has been used as an excuse. Decanting size can only be near the projects. As a result, it really limits the possibilities. Now, can we consider relaxing the standard for choosing a decanting size? We can even select decanting size farther away from the project. We are glad to see that in the policy address, DC has promised to start reclamation for the KYC artificial island by year 2025. With the latest technology, we expect there can be housing projects, housing construction within 3 to 5 years. Now, for urban areas, we should promote larger-scale urban renewal projects to offer decanting sites for residents. Will the government also consider offering decanting sites on the future KYC islands and other reclamated sites? Now, there are a lot of estimations offered by the Housing Authority. Besides considering the number of housing use, we have to consider that redevelopment projects may be the only chance for residents to live bigger and live better. So besides considering redevelopment's potential, we should also consider enhancing the individual living space from 7 meters to 9 meters, for example. We cannot afford to allow redevelopment projects to become a nano-size flex. Thank you. Mr. Chen Kin-po. Madam Deputy, housing has always been our concern. Recently, the government has identified sites to meet the demand for housing for the next 10 years. However, this is a very pressing demand. The latest waiting time for PRH is 6 years. In its first policy address to further cut waiting time, the CE proposed the idea of light public housing, compressing the construction timetable to 4 years, and also set a target to shorten the waiting time to 4.5 years. Of course, these are new measures, and there are a lot of challenges. The government is facing the challenges, and it shows that it is very resolute in dealing with the problem. I support the original motion moved by Mr. Scott Leung. In year 2013, the Housing Authority has conducted assessments concerning the redevelopment of 14 housing estates, but only 3 housing estates have redevelopment timetable in sight. Now, one housing estate is 70 years old, and 4 housing estates in the project are 60 years old. Now, there are some housing estates which really require a redevelopment immediately. The government says that redevelopment projects would lengthen the waiting time for first allocation because it would limit the housing units available for rehousing in the short run. The government has promised to conduct a full investigation on the structural safety of old housing estates. Well, I see the government's points, but we cannot dawdle in terms of redeveloping old housing estates. These old buildings may not have an imminent risk of collapsing. However, there are a lot of problems. For example, exposure of steel bars, concrete spalling, water seepage, and also they have very poor hygiene. With the passage of time, their condition will worsen and cause nuisance to residents. If we have to wait for new public housing estates to be built, well, maybe there can only be redevelopment when these buildings are 80 to 90 years old. New housing estates can only be constructed. Redevelopment projects may take 10 years' time, but they are very beneficial. It will enhance living condition of residents and make the neighborhood more pretty. More importantly, it can enhance the long-term supply of public housing estates. According to the institutions, new public housing estates can be built to 50 floors high, and the housing yield will be 50% higher. There are lots of challenges to redevelopment, but we cannot afford to delay addressing these problems. We should bite the bullet and be determined to address the problem. Now, the Wafu Estate is one such example. The government has rezoned the Greenbelt sites and near Wafu Estate as decanting sites to make in situ rehousing possible. The government should adopt similar models to offer redevelopment for other housing estates. And also, we can also use phased redevelopments. There are many premises, for example, vacant school premises and other vacant sites for decanting. And also, we can consider squeezing in public housing estates in available sites. And also, we should encourage members of the public or the affected residents to purchase flats under the green formed subsidized housing scheme. Well, with this mindset, it is definitely feasible. Thank you. Reverend Peter Kuhn. Madam Deputy, in recent years, shortage of housing supply is the problem that has been troubling us. Private housing units are expensive. Grassroots people have to wait for a long time to be allocated with a PRH unit. For general applicants, the normal waiting time is 6 years. For single elderly persons, they also have to wait 4 years. In this year's policy address, there are a number of measures announced to enhance the supply. Still, there are a lot of uncertainties, including land zoning and also transport infrastructure. The epidemic also affects the progress of construction and also other unexpected factors which may cause the housing problem to worsen. I'm pleased to see that there is a new steering group established as well as a task force to monitor the supply of land for public housing estates. And also a cap has been set on the waiting time, thus enhancing the quality, and number. With the shortage of land in urban area, the government should adopt a multi-pronged approach to increase land supply. Besides continuing to identify new sites, redevelopment of aged public housing estates is also a feasible way to address the problem. There are many benefits. First, by enhancing plot ratio, we can build buildings higher and wider without adding to the cost. And also by redeveloping old public housing estates, we can improve the living condition of the residents. Third, we can meet the aspiration of members of the public who want to live in urban area. Fourthly, we can address the safety issue of old buildings. For example, Choi Hong Estate is 40 years old. There have been many cases of concrete spalling, exposure of steel bar and water seepage. These are structural issues which affect the safety and personal health of residents. Still, there is no redevelopment plan in sight for Choi Hong Estate. The Housing Authority considered the feasibility of using another vacant site for in situ decanting or rehousing for Choi Hong estates. However, some residents were offered the green farm subsidized housing application opportunities, and the government missed out on the chance to redevelop Choi Hong estates. Redevelopment projects can increase land housing supply and provide a safer and better living environment for residents. Of course, we cannot reach the goal overnight. The major obstacle is in situ rehousing. The waiting list is very long, and also units have to be set aside for residents affected by redevelopment. But we really should endure the short-term pain. Inevitably, it would lengthen the waiting time in the short run. In the long run, however, we can increase the number of housing yields and also increase the living standard in Hong Kong. It is worth doing. The government should make land use planning in advance. Otherwise, when the urban land resources are depleted, it would be even more difficult to find decanting sites or rehousing sites. We should also revisit the redevelopment potential of housing estates under the housing authority. I think there are always more solutions than problems. This is a long-standing issue. It is a test for the new term government's ability to be flexible and rise above challenges. Instead of dawdling, I hope the government can take aggressive measures to give better homes to residents. Thank you.
Mr. Vincent Chang. Thank you, Madam Deputy. First of all, I'd like to thank Mr. Man-kwong for moving the original motion. I support that. And the DAB has also proposed something similar. I also agree with Mr. Yang's amendment. When it comes to redevelopment of public housing estates, I share similar experience with LEUNG Man-kwong, because we have gone through a redevelopment project of a public housing estate, that is a Shekip-made estate. We can see that the buildings are aging, we see spalling, we see water seepage. We visited some units and we witnessed that a piece of concrete fell from the ceiling. In that estate, many residents are elderly, living alone, so that is indeed a hazard to them. The Sham Shui Po District Council has been fighting for redevelopment of Shekip-made estate. That is not the only estate. There are many other estates that have a real need for redevelopment. Of course, I understand the explanation given to me by the Bureau. I would like to see people living in subdivided units being housed in public housing. But there is indeed for some estates that needs redevelopment. You said that there are about 20 or so estates that are aged above 40 that could be redevelopment. But so far we've only seen 4 being planned. Many of these old housing estates can't wait any longer, so the speed should be picked up. Pak Tin Estate, which is next to Shekip-made Estate, is a good example. It was well done, executed. Upon redevelopment, 8,300 units, an extra 3,500 units were provided. The extra units benefit residents in the area as well as those on the waiting list. A lot of these old housing estates are in urban areas. We are developing new public housing estates in new areas, but there is indeed huge potential in the urban area if old housing estates are redeveloped. So I support Mr. Leung's original motion, and we think that the plot ratio could be increased. For example, Pak Tin Estate, the PR plot ratio has been increased to 9. I'd like to declare that I am a non-executive director of the URA, the Urban Renewal Authority. They are conducting a study of redevelopment in Sham Shui Po. I hope that the Housing Bureau will talk to the Development Bureau. When I talk to other people, I always say that they should not just look at redevelopment of old buildings in the urban area. They could consider a redevelopment of old housing estates, say in Sham Shui Po, and the redevelopment could be done by phases. It has happened before, so I'd like to hear a reply from the Bureau. I have another example to give. Tai Hang Estate West. With the coordination of the Housing Authority, there was a plan for redevelopment. I hope the plan will be announced soon. I also would like the Bureau will improve the facilities in public housing estates. I'm glad to see in the policy address that they've selected 5 estates to conduct improvement measures with a particular theme. I hope that ball courts and gardens in public housing estates will meet expectations. Old estates should provide good facilities to improve the sense of well-being of residents. I know the redevelopment task is daunting. I hope the Bureau Secretary will not be stopped or deterred by the difficulties. I support both the original motion and the amendment. Mr. Jeffrey Lam. Mr. John Lee, the CE, announced in his policy address that there will be plans to resolve certain problems. He put a cap on the waiting time of public housing estates that by 2026-27, the waiting time will be reduced to about 4.5 years. However, when it comes to identifying land, construction, planning of facilities, it will easily take 8 to 10 years. We think that redevelopment of public housing estates should be sped up because that is the most efficient way. We have about 800,000 public housing units. Of these units, about 190,000 of them are aged. They are from about 60 public housing estates. Over the years, there has been strong views asking for redevelopment of aged housing estates. These aged housing estates bring problems, say for example, spalling, water seepage. For certain old housing estates, they don't even have lifts, so it's difficult for elderly people to go back to move around. Our alliance has been advocating for redevelopment of public housing estate and to increase the plot ratio. This will allow households in need to be allocated a unit as soon as possible. This will also elevate our housing problem. Regrettably, we have not seen any large-scale plans of redevelopment from the government. Pak Tin Estate, Wafu Estate, Meitong Estate, upon redevelopment, will provide about 8,200 units. We have seen that redevelopment will bring more potential than identifying land for construction. Why will the government go along the hard way? We should start with infrastructure. That is something that we've been advocating. Existing estates provide infrastructure, say for example, pedestrian walkway, open space. If we make the most of plot ratio and build as many units as possible, then we can shorten the waiting time for public housing applicants. There are a lot of vacant school premises, and the ball courts are underutilized. There can be in situ redevelopment of housing estates. They can demolish an estate and rehouse the residents in the same area. If you do it by phases, it will be easier than starting from scratch. It will take less time too. If you make use of vacant land in existing housing estates for redevelopment, and if you tell residents that they will be rehoused in the same district in the future and there will be more open space, I'm sure they will welcome it. There is another issue that I'd like to talk about. Proper use of public housing units. We've often heard that these units have been used as storage or an entertainment unit. Some households only go back to the units once every year. Do they actually have housing need? If they've been hogging the unit and not use it, is it fair to those on the waiting list? I think that the government should be more open-minded to plan better for redevelopment of housing estates. Our alliance has been making numerous proposals. We hope that the government will be more people-oriented and seriously consider our proposals. I'm sure that they will be able to find solutions that are acceptable to them. Mr. Chen Xiu-hong. Thank you, Madam Deputy. First of all, I support Mr. Leung Man-kwong's original motion on promoting the redevelopment of aged public housing estates and Mr. Yang's amendment that both are from C15+. There are numerous estates that are over the age of 50 years. We see problems in the form of water seepage and spoiling. Maintenance cost is high and it troubles residents. These are safety hazards. For these old housing estates, the plot ratio has not been exhausted. I do think there is a need for redevelopment of aged public housing estates to ensure safety for residents and at the same time increase provision of units. The new government would like to make use of light public housing and transitional housing to reduce waiting time from 6 to 4.5 years. In the long run, redevelopment of aged public housing estates will increase housing supply, but in the short run, it may reduce the number of units available. With an acute demand, large-scale redevelopment plans may take up available public housing for rehousing, and this will lengthen the waiting time. And it will take time to build units in the redevelopment plans. So, well, when it comes to Mr. Leung's original motion, he talks about a redevelopment of aged public housing estates. The emphasis is on in an orderly manner. The redevelopment of old public housing estates would make it more effective. In 2013, 22 estates have been identified by the HA for redevelopment. So far, only Pak Tin, Man-kwong, and 2 others have been executed. And also there is Saiwan Estate and a number of others that are being planned. But for the other aged housing estates, there is no specific plan. So residents living in these old housing estates are still living in an unsafe home. You need people to feel safe and secure before they have a sense of security. I hope that there can be a timetable for redevelopment. Housing estates aged above 50 should be redeveloped in an orderly manner. Between 1987 and 2012, a similar plan was put in place. 560 estates have been planned, and they have given us a timetable that certain estates will be redeveloped. Previously, there was a shortage of rehousing resources. For Kai Tak, there is available resources for Chakolang village, Ngao Chi Wan village, and Chok Yun village for redevelopment. The government should seize these new public housing resources for rehousing to redeveloped aged housing estates, say for example Oimen Estate and Choi Hong Estate. In the future, if they miss this opportunity, it will be very difficult for them to find similar resources. The HA and the HS should work together. They are both public bodies. For the squatter housing areas that are being planned for redevelopment, the resources could be used for rehousing, and this will be conducive for redevelopment of aged housing estate. And the HA has been making the decision with 4 principles, that is, availability of rehousing resources in the vicinity. I support in situ settlement for affected residents, but for some areas there is no such resources. So I do think that when it comes to same area rehousing, they should identify bigger areas, say Kowloon East. Redevelopment of old housing estates can improve the living environment and improve housing supply. But when it comes to striking a balance, the government should make a wise decision.
Mr. Andrew Lam. Thank you, Madam Deputy. I support Mr. Man-kwong from C15 Plus motion. We have an older public housing stock, and they gradually become dilapidated. And it's natural that from time to time they will have accidents, and there are cries in the community to redevelop aged PH estates to improve the living environment of residents and to increase PRH supply. This is understandable. Mr. Man-kwong's motion asked for a timetable and to utilize resources of newly built public housing and facilitate the collaboration of different housing organizations. I truly agree with him. In 2013, when the government reviewed 22 PH estates, only 3 have been redeveloped so far, as said by Mr. Chan Siu-hong. The pace is far too slow. We have over 140,000 flats aged between 40 and 60 years old, and the number of flats older than 30 years old have increased by 3-fold within a few years. Now, if we rely on repair and maintenance to buy time, we do not have too many flats where this approach can apply. I think it is a matter of urgency that we have to redevelop these old housing estates. Now, for interest and concern groups, of course, they ask for in situ rehousing, but it's not easy to identify sites. And then it's also difficult to have in situ rehousing, and it's not easy to improve the living conditions of residents. And therefore, I support collaboration of different organizations. Still, resources available will be limited, and the core issues have yet to be addressed. The government is proposing development of reclamation of Khao Yi Chau, the artificial islands, and also northern metropolis. Future supply will for sure help decanting of old PRH residents, and new developments can expedite reurbanization or renewal of urban areas. However, these are just at their conceptual stage. Now, we haven't got a systematic plan for redevelopment, and members of the public are not sure whether their wish can be granted, that is, to have better living environment. Now, we can make use of space available in the urban area. No matter how difficult, I'm sure we can achieve in situ rehousing. Take Wharf as an example. The green belt at Kai Long Wan South is now used for decanting. And then together with 5 sites in the vicinity, we have 13 hectares to be developed together with the current Wafu estate, so that upon completion, there can be rehousing in nearby places, and then another 50,000 flats can be provided. We should make good use of Greenbelt. They can be rezoned to residential zones. For instance, it is proposed that 3 PRH blocks providing 3,000 odd units can be built to the west of Chengyi Road. I think these are examples of success. After the government take pains to get support, I think we should insist on redevelopment with the objective to improve residents' living environment. And if we have proper collaboration and support, then we can redevelop old housing estates. Thank you. Mr. Lai Tong Kwok. Madam Deputy, I thank Mr. Man-kwong for sponsoring this motion. Indeed, there are quite a number of aged PH estates in Hong Kong. In 2013, a study by HA identified 22 old PRH estates with potential for redevelopment. However, only 3 have been redeveloped since. Now, if the study were to be done today, we could not imagine what will be the figure identified. Of course, the government must reiterate its position. Now, the 22 housing estates were only included in the study. It doesn't represent a checklist for redevelopment, and they have got 4 principles they have to consider: the structural conditions, effectiveness of repair works, etc. I think the greatest reason for this slow pace is because officials responsible for housing have for long felt that redevelopment in the long run can increase supply of PRH, but in the short term, it would reduce the number of flats available for allocation. The PRH waiting time has been rising. People have waited too long, and I think this is the headache of many terms of government. Just last month, the chief executive in his policy address put forward a very challenging target, and that is to have an integrated waiting time for PRH to reflect the waiting time for light public housing and PRH. And in the coming 4 years, the integrated waiting time for PRH will be reduced from 6 years to 4.5 years. The government is doing its utmost to identify land for PRH development, and it may be a tall order to expect the government to expedite redevelopment of old housing estates. Still, I think the proposal in the motion to ask the government to set a redevelopment timetable is worth considering. Now, the recent policy address has formulated 110 indicators, performance indicators, but there is nothing among them on development or redevelopment of PRH estates. Now, even though we are not going to set hard targets for redevelopment, we can at least have the following indicators. For instance, by a certain date, the number of PRH flats to be redeveloped. To be fair, the government has been redeveloping old housing estates. In the past 10 years, the HA has completed redevelopment of 3 housing estates, and it is now taking forward another 8. I hope the administration can bear in mind what Presidency said, and that is to struggle and work hard to improve the welfare of our people, while the government is trying hard to build new flats for PRH applicants. Don't forget that there are residents living in aged housing estates with very unique problems, such as concrete spalling, exposed steel bars in reinforced concrete, and water seepage, and also mobility and accessibility problems for the elderly residents. You must improve their living environment. I so submit, Madam Chair. Ms. Judy Chan. Thank you, Madam Chair. For most of us living in Hong Kong, we have to face housing problems. Whether we have a place to live is an issue, where is another, and even we have a roof over our head, the location or the condition may not be very desirable. For tenants living in old housing estates, they face a lot of problems as well. So I'm grateful to Mr. Man-kwong for moving this motion on promoting the redevelopment of aged public housing estates. Now, we used to have the Transparent Housing Bureau. Now is split into 2, with the objective of allowing the government to take a more targeted approach to address housing problems in Hong Kong. The CE, in his maiden policy address, had a number of initiatives to address housing issues. Now, the Housing Authority is asked to identify another public housing estate for study to add to the 10 it is already working on. So hopefully we can see enhanced quantity, speed, efficiency, and quality in housing. As we all know, redevelopment of aged PH estate is to ensure sustainability. We understand that the HA has got 4 basic principles when considering redevelopment, including structural condition of the buildings, cost effectiveness of repair works, availability of suitable housing resources in the vicinity, and also build back potential upon redevelopment. If we do not have a plan, then it will be hard for us to cope with the ever-changing situation. So whether we have suitable rehousing resources in the vicinity of the estates to be redeveloped, one of the principles upheld by the HI, I hope it can revisit this principle to see whether it is realistic. I understand the people affected, of course, want in situ rehousing, but usually we draw the line according to district council boundaries or the area boundaries, but that may delay the speed of redevelopment. I hope the HA will, with regard to the actual circumstances, tell members of the public what is the definition of in situ rehousing. The government can consider expanding the definition of in situ rehousing. For instance, instead of boundaries of areas in district councils, we can use the boundaries of the whole district council for defining in situ rehousing. Otherwise, we will repeat a very painful experience of Wang Fu Estate. Now, let me talk about history. Wang Fu Estate was completed in the 1960s. And then in the 1990s, the structural problems started to emerge. So steel bars were used to reinforce the structure to lengthen the life of the housing estate. And in early 2000, there was the discussion on how to redevelop Wafu Estate. Back then, the thinking was, can they use Wong Chuk Hang Estate about to be demolished for decanting? But of course, the site was subsequently granted to the MTLCL for private housing development and also the Wong Chuk Hang Station. And so it took another 20 years for redevelopment of Wafu Estate to be finalized, and the project won't be completed until 2041. I hope we will not repeat the painful experience of Wafu Estate. We hope that redevelopment can be speeded up. I support the motion and the amendment, and we should resort to all ways and means to expedite the redevelopment of old housing estates.
Mr. Leung, I speak in support of the original motion and the amendments moved by Mr. Gibson Yang. To live better is always the aspiration of people. To allocate people with adequate housing is the target of the housing authority. Technologies have been employed to enhance the quality and speed of housing supply. Now, in terms of the investigation timetable, before planning redevelopment projects for old housing estates, the structural safety or structural integrity would be investigated. There are also members mentioning problems like concrete spalling and water seepage of old buildings. There have been two cycles of comprehensive structural investigation program. 3 years were spent to investigate the structural integrity of 42 housing estates. Back then, the technology was not as advanced. It took longer. The second cycle, however, would be 71 housing estates by year 2037. It still takes 14 years, which is the same as the first cycle. So I would like to know how the government can pick up speed and quantity on investigation. If investigation alone takes so long, then the redevelopment schedule would be even longer. So I urge the government to compress the investigation timetable. Second question. My second point is, in year 2013, 22 housing estates were identified for redevelopment. After many years, only 3 projects were started. Why are so few housing estates selected for redevelopment after such a long time? I really hope the government can speed up the process in this regard. In terms of enhancing quality and effectiveness, I have been talking with some members of the Institute of Surveyors. They have raised many suggestions on how to increase speed. That is the use of technologies as well as recruiting talents to enhance supply of housing units. The Institute urges the government to increase the number of floors to 50 in the next 5 years, so that the housing use can be increased by 25%. For transitional housing, the number of floors should be increased from 4 to 6 or 8, so as to speed up phasing out subdivided units. I'm really pleased to have these professional inputs from the institution, so that we can make some practical suggestions to the Secretary. In terms of approval procedures and also amendments of legislation, the Institute urges the government to streamline internal guidelines to encourage civil servants to be bolder in terms of exercising their professional judgment. There have been too many overlapping regulations in the past. As a result, the process has been slowed. In dealing with different applications, civil servants have many concerns. For example, for the GBP of plot of building plans, the Institute's calls for streamlined approach to assess only the necessary criteria. Now, to make housing estates more vibrant, maybe the government can adopt a mixed income model or mixed revenue model to speed up the redevelopment pace. In the United States and in Canada, there are urban planning with equity in mind to eliminate or reduce the wealth gap of residents in the neighborhood. There are also smart planning principles which will enhance the sustainability of the neighborhood. I hope the government can consider this. Thank you. Mr. Ronnie Chen. Madam Deputy, in year 1987, to improve the living condition of residents in housing estates, the Housing Authority rolled out the comprehensive structural investigation program and also the redevelopment projects. Some 70 old housing estates were demolished because they didn't have the proper ancillary facilities and have structural issues. So most of the buildings were located in urban areas and there were economic benefits. With the Maltao second estate being demolished in year 2012, the project was completed. And then the government pledges to select housing estates for redevelopment according to the condition. I thank Mr. Scott Leung for moving this motion so that we can discuss how to increase housing units supply and improve living condition of residents. On redevelopment policy for housing estates, and the Housing Authority will take into consideration 4 major considerations which have been mentioned by other members. I agree with Mr. Chen Hok-fung that we should reconsider the priority of these 4 considerations with structural condition given the highest priority. If that's the case, that would be a different result for the previous review, a round of review. The lifespan of concrete or steel bar is 50 years in Hong Kong. Many housing estates are already 40 years old. Maintenance is poor. Some flats are experiencing concrete spalling, water seepage, and exposed steel bar. Residents are getting older in these estates, yet there are insufficient support for elderly care. In year 2018, 42 housing estates have been investigated in terms of their structural integrity. For the remaining 19, there was no investigation and they were assessed as safe. This year, I have opened an office in Qingyi. In that public housing estate is only 33 years old. That is the Chang'an estate. Well, I often receive complaints that the flat condition is poor with falling parts of ceilings as well as the water seepage. Housing supply is a long-term policy, and we cannot reach there overnight. However, we lack a plan and a timetable. There is not a timetable for redeveloping housing estates. If the Housing Authority can formulate a plan to take forward redevelopment projects in an orderly manner, we can surely cut the waiting time for PRH and hence housing and land supply. Different redevelopment plans have their own limitations. According to for redevelopment of public housing estates, many residents prefer in situ rehousing, and it is in fact inevitable to lengthen the waiting time for PRH allocation in the short run. However, we should take a flexible mindset. For example, the model estate, which is 70 years old, there are only 700 housing units. If we can enhance the plot ratio, we can achieve 17,000 housing units used, which is 23 times as many as before. the benefits is huge. So I urge the government to set down a timetable for redevelopment of housing estates and coordinate the efforts of different housing organizations, enhance speed on redevelopment with a policy support, and also continue to enhance land supply with a multi-pronged approach so that we can achieve, we can meet the short and medium and long-term housing needs of the people. Thank you. Mr. Tony Chair. Thank you, Madam Deputy. Compared with private old buildings, housing estates managed by housing authority is enjoying comparatively better maintenance, but it doesn't mean that there is no need for redevelopment. Many housing estates has a low development density. Plot ratio and BRH are not maximized. Several years ago, together with experts in the field, I have put forward suggestions to the government to redevelop old housing for old housing estates with a lower development parameter. We can build modular. We can build some temporary housing units with MIC method in the vicinity. However, the suggestion was not taken on board by the government. By demolishing or redeveloping housing estates and wholesale, of course, we can achieve more housing yield. And also with redevelopments, we can improve the support and ancillary facilities for residents. These old housing estates has a serious lack of elderly care facilities for their residents. And also, after redevelopments, there will be more elderly and child-friendly facilities, as well as facilities of gerontology, which can enhance cross-generational harmony. Several years ago, I submitted a report to the Housing Authority and the Housing Society, some of which have been accepted by them. In terms of elderly-friendly design for public housing units, the government has heard me, but no action was taken. With so many potential benefits, why isn't the government speeding up redevelopment for housing estates? Well, the major obstacle is rehousing plans for existing residents. The majority or a large proportion of residents are old. They don't want to move away from their community. And also, it would be difficult for them to seek medical assistance elsewhere. And also, some of their family members are working in the same district. If they have to move to another district, the transportation costs would be higher. These are indeed obstacles, but as a responsible government, the government should face these challenges head-on. The best solution would, of course, be providing public housing estates and in the vicinity of these old housing estates, but it is not a very feasible solution because of land shortage. And also, redevelopment projects would also affect new public housing unit supply in the short run. Another solution is to squeeze in some transitional building in available areas in the housing estates, say for example, basketball courts, and then move on with the construction schedule. However, nuisances would be caused to residents during the construction stage, for example, pollution or noise. Another option is to offer subsidy and allowances on transport for residents who are willing to move to another area. Concerning the extra time costs on transport, the government can offer comparable subsidy or allowances to them. It may be cost effective for the government as well, because maintenance costs can be saved. Most importantly, people would be happy. So I hope the government can offer more incentives to enhance the speed of redevelopment and think of other solutions other than in situ rehousing. Thank you. Dr. Priscilla.
本人呢
Madam Deputy, on the 18th of August 2021, in a Chief Executive question and answer session, I asked the then Chief Executive, Mrs. Carrie Lam. I said that in August the year before, a blind old person got something unexpected. It wasn't an unexpected winning of the lottery. It was an unexpected hit by a piece of concrete falling from the ceiling. The old lady, as I said, was blind. She called for assistance from the housing authority. The housing authority said that repair would be arranged, but you would have to pay for immediate repair. Her son came to visit her and got another unexpected hit by another piece of concrete falling from the ceiling, hitting his foot. The outside of Shekip Maid Estate was quite nice because phases 1 to 3 and 5 to 7 have been redeveloped, but still 9 blocks were not redeveloped. There are plenty of problems inside the flat. And in 2018, we took the then Secretary, Mr. Frank Chen, to the district. The BPA said that there are 19 aged housing estates that should see redevelopment by having barriers removed. These barriers are not just in the form of policies, but mentality as well. Chief executives, of course, respect the reports submitted by civil servants. The then chief executive said to me in reply that, of course, if there are hazards inside the flat, we would ask the housing authority to do it expediently. So for the blind granny, it was an extraordinary case. So the old lady was moved to live with her daughter while the flat was being repaired. But what about other residents? If you go to these estates, you could easily see blocks of concrete falling from the ceiling. The chief executive said that there were 100,000 people on the waiting list. But if old estates are redeveloped, then people on the waiting list would be affected. We gave her numerous solutions. Now we have factory estates being redeveloped. But actually, with the 3 estates, and Mata Wai Estate and Saiwan Estate, there was no action taken. So I do think that individual departments are still stuck in that mentality in the old days. For Tai Hang Estate West, I've been following the case for 8 years. Finally, we see a glimmer of hope. At that time, it was a different organization that owned the estate. But there was serious water seepage. The government intervened, and things changed. After redevelopment, the number of units increased from 1,600 to 3,300. But what about public housing estates? If you explain very clear to the general public, and if you can get the understanding of the 100,000 people on the waiting list, I'm sure they will understand. You can redevelop these old housing estates, say for Circuit Made Estate, you can make use of the vast basketball court for rehousing, and you can redevelop block by block. It is feasible. I worked with you and we resolved the problems of redevelopment of Pak Tin Estate. I participated in numerous residents' meetings. Of course, there are always difficulties, but there are more ways to resolve them than one. All we need to do is to work together, and I'm sure that most legislators would agree with the motion. I so submit. Mr. Ngan Man Yu. Madam Deputy, we see the problem of aging estates in Hong Kong. Many of them have problems such as water seepage and spalling, and it is also a serious hazard. The design of old housing estate does not meet the needs of modern days. There are also problems with pollution of drinking water from the pipes. There has been strong views for redevelopment of old housing estates. The government should pick up the speed and make changes. In a policy address, the chief executive used a breakthrough approach to make changes, say for example putting a cap on waiting list and using a different approach for public housing. But when it comes to redevelopment, he has not come up with anything new. We hear the same reply, and people in these old estates have been waiting and waiting. There are many estates built in the 1960s and 70s under the HA and the HS. They cannot meet the needs of current days. Say, for example, stairs, steps, lack of lifts, and the lack of non-slip design because of the restrictions of these old estates. Although we see that the HA is working very hard to repair the facilities, but there are inherent problems of these old estates. You could spend an astronomical amount to repair them, but nothing will get improved. We have precious land in the urban area. Of course, the applicants would like to live in urban areas where the infrastructure is in place. Say Choi Hong Pingsat Warlock Estates. They are close to trunk routes. They're close to MTR stations. These old estates have a low density. Upon redevelopment, the plot ratio could be raised. A lot of people will benefit from redevelopment. There is huge potential of redevelopment of housing estates in the urban area, but the government is quite passive. Say, for example, when it comes to the Comprehensive Structural Investigation Program, it only covers aged public estates to see how they can be repaired. It may be an important part of redevelopment, but in 2018, there are 71 estates with 519 blocks being planned for redevelopment, but the investigation plan will only be completed in 2032. For those living in old buildings, that is a long wait. For Choi Hong Estate, 60 years old, is dilapidated. Many residents talk about exposure of steel bars, water seepage, and spalling. And there has been numerous occasions when falling concrete hit people. Different organizations and parties have come up with different redevelopment plans. The Transport Department said that they will have to wait for redevelopment of the estate to resolve the roundabout problem. But we have not seen anything concrete about the redevelopment. The government can speed up the comprehensive structural investigation program and come up with a timetable of redevelopment in order to release land potential. I think that should be a key area of work of the current government. There should be land set aside for redevelopment of housing estates to rehouse residents affected. And this will also enhance their sense of belonging to the community. Apart from increasing speed, efficiency, and quantity, as well as quality, quality is also very important. Redevelopment of all housing estates will release potential. It's not just about increasing housing supply, will also improve living condition of grassroots households. I so submit. Mr. Chow Siu Chung. Promoting the redevelopment of aged public housing estates will provide a better living environment. It is also an opportunity to improve community facilities. In the long run, it will increase housing supply to alleviate the increasing demand. I strongly support the original motion of Mr. Leung and the amendment of Mr. Yang. Apart from aging public housing estates, I'm also concerned about the aging population of the residents and lack of supporting facilities. In the past 5 years, for HA housing estates, the percentage of aged residents has increased from 18% in 2016 to 22% in 2021. You can see that the age of the residents is increasing, and this will increase the demand for community facilities, say for example elderly home or residential care home. But there is a lack of supporting facilities. The facilities cannot meet the demand of the aging population. In Kowloon East, there are a number of old public housing estates. In 2021, for Kowloon East, the population of those above the age of 65 is about 300,000. But there are only 5,500 places for residential care home. That means there are only 18 subsidized places for residential elderly care per 1,000 people above the age of 65, which is far lower than the standard in Hong Kong PSG. The government needs to do more to respond to the demand for residential services for the elderly. In 2020, the government proposed that in future public housing development, there will be about 5% of gross floor area set aside for social welfare facilities. I strongly support this. If this can be properly executed, then it will plug the gap between the difference of demand, the shortage in supply. But you need to let residents know about the plan as soon as possible. More details should be released, and there should be timely review. In areas with a high elderly population, say for example Kowloon East, a higher percentage of the floor area should be set aside to meet the need for elderly services so that residents can stay in their very own community to use the service. Redevelopment of housing estates should be done in an orderly manner. A timetable should be prepared. The government should also take into account public projects in the pipeline, so to avoid them being crunched up within a very short time. Because when there are too many projects, there is a high risk of accidents. I so submit.
Mr. Kwok Wai Keung. Thank you, Madam Deputy. I'm grateful to Mr. Man-kwong for moving this motion. Aging of buildings is not a problem faced by private housing alone. Public housing is also aging. The motion is excellent, promoting the redevelopment of aged PH estates. Why do we have to promote? Because they are not doing it. And 22 PH estates covered in a study have not been attended to because the government feels that redevelopment of PH estate is in conflict with increased supply of PRH flats. They are going at full steam to boost efficiency and quality and quantity of PRH development. And if we redevelop old PH estates, then we will delay or further lengthen the waiting time. But I don't think this is the right approach. Why do we have vacant flats in PRH? Because flats recovered are not very acceptable to the applicants. It's only 34%. And for future allocation, that is in 2022-23, 27,000 flats will be offered. And over 10,000 of them are recovered and refurbished flats. The question is the quality of these flats. Some of them might have had some unpleasant incidents, but most of them are old PRH flats. Now, for those who have waited for more than 6 years, that's the common waiting time. Some have waited for 6, 7, 8 years. So 6 is only the average time, not the actual time. So an applicant has been waiting for almost 9 years. Of course, he wants a flat of good condition. He doesn't want to be offered old and dilapidated flat. And so expediting redevelopment doesn't conflict with flat production. Those on the waiting list would like to be offered new flats. They don't want to live or given, no, they don't want to be given an old flat. And why are we so eager, so earnest to redevelop old flats? Because you may still recall Mr. Wong Kwok-heng, who was so diligent. He promoted redevelopment together with me on Wah Fu Estate. It was already in the 2014 policy address, but it won't be completed even in 2024. 5 sites had to be identified to be reformed, and then the first batch of population will move in 2025. So there must be advanced preparation and arrangement before redevelopment can be done. A few days ago, I visited Wah Fu Estate again to meet some of the old gaifongs there. Let me show you a picture. So there hasn't been any improvement to the condition of Wah Fu Estate in the past 10 years. There might be some repair and maintenance, but they fail to address the fundamental issues. For instance, concrete spalling from the ceiling, even though it's been repainted every year, but there is dampness inside the ceiling. And even skilled technicians cannot resolve these problems, cannot remove the cracks. So they have waited for a decade. And what some of the gaifongs wanted redevelopment to proceed further, but some of them said to me that even though Wah Fu Estate is redeveloped, it may not benefit me at all. I was 16 when they first talked of redevelopment. Now I'm 70. I may not live long enough to enjoy the redeveloped flats. Now, since the administration is so eager to address the aspirations of the people, please listen to the wishes of people living in these housing estates. Don't just give us excuses. You have to face the aspirations, face up to the aspirations of gaifongs squarely. You have to tell them why you haven't heeded their cause now. Now, for URA, if there are suitable projects, please take care of nearby old PH estates that should be redeveloped. Thank you. Mr. Wai-kwok. Madam Deputy, I thank Mr. Man-kwong for sponsoring the original motion and Mr. Yang Wing-kit for moving an amendment to urge the administration to promote the redevelopment of aged PH estates to improve living conditions of residents and to increase flat supply in the long run. Mr. Johnny, in his policy address, announced that the waiting time for PRH be capped immediately, and the integrated waiting time should be reduced from 6 years to 4.5 years in 4 years' time. On the 7th of November, at the housing panel meeting where we received a policy briefing by the Secretary for Housing, we were told that the government, in addition to 10 redevelopment projects, it would like to identify a few more PH estates for study. I think the government should be more aggressive. One more PH estate to be considered for redevelopment is far too few. Now, we have a lot of housing issues. We have to address the problem of subdivided units and old and dilapidated PH estates. The residents there face inadequate housing. As quoted, examples quoted by members have spoken. BPA in September 2019 proposed a study. We urge the administration to accord priority to redevelopment of PR estates. There should be redevelopment studies of 17 housing estates and maximize the plot ratio with 6.5 so that we can maximize land resources. Redeveloped estates can improve the living environment of residents, and there will be considerable increase in flat number that can effectively reduce the waiting time. And BPA put together another report in September. We submitted the report to the CE during the PA consultation. We put forward 8 major recommendations. We should make good use of land resources, enhance our land processing procedures. The government should depart from its conservative approach and consider redevelopment as a major source of flat supply. There are 17 PH estates, another 7 PH estates completed before 1980s. Now they have great potential upon redevelopment. There are also vacant school campuses there, and the utilization rate of some recreational facilities such as basketball courts were very low. So the government can consider building 1 or 2 blocks in these vacant premises for decanting, and then the flats or the buildings vacated can then be redeveloped. This bit-by-bit approach can ensure gradual and orderly redevelopment and can also ensure in situ rehousing, thereby to secure more support from the local community. After redevelopment, there will be a lot more flats, and then with proper transport support, they will be very popular among the PRH applicants. Now we must have proper planning. We must support HS and HA and other housing organizations to collaborate together to integrate, consolidate land resources, and we should also use MIC building technology to increase flat supply in the long run. With these remarks, I support the original motion and the amendment. Mr. Louis Leung. Madam Deputy, according to information from Government Web, Under the HA, there are 9 housing estates older than 50 years. There are accounting for about 4% of the 230 odd PH estates we have. By 2027, we will have another 23 housing estates older than 50 years old, and by then about 10% of the housing stock of the HA will be old housing estates. In between 1978 and 1982, 32 PH estates were completed and commissioned. In other words, by 2032, these 32 housing estates will be 50 years old. And if the 50 housing estates I mentioned earlier were not redeveloped, then the total number of old housing estates owned by HA will be more than 20%, and we face an aging housing stock, and cost repair and maintenance is going to be very costly. While the secretary said that they have refurbishment measures, but for raw materials used for flat construction, such as steel bars and reinforced concrete, usually they have a lifespan of 50 years only. Therefore, tenants are complaining that there are safety hazards such as water seepage, exposed steel bars, and concrete spoiling, causing nuisance to residents. In 2019, BPA already conducted a thematic study on redevelopment of old housing estates, and we published a report on redevelopment of PH estates. We urge the administration to consider redevelopment plans, timetable, and roadmap for 19 housing estates not considered for redevelopment by HA, and the plot ratio control should be relaxed to increase flat supply. In his policy address, the CE raised a number of initiatives to increase and expedite the supply of PRH, but those measures do not include redevelopment of old housing estates. HA is now working on 10 redevelopment projects covering 5 aged PH estates. Policy address suggested that the HA select one more PH estate for study. And then there was the annual report of the long-term housing strategy. In the coming 10 years, there will be 340,000 households affected by redevelopment. For the 10 years starting from 2023-24, the number of redeveloped units will only be 35,000 together by HA and HS. That is less than 3,000 units per year. This goes to show that the amount of redevelopment projects will be very limited in the coming 10 years. One of the obstacles is in situ rehousing, because the PRH waiting list is already so long. They find it hard to use flats for decanting. Since this government is result-oriented, it should think of ways to address this problem so as to cater for the welfare of our people. Now, for smaller PH estates, the number of households affected will be smaller, and they should be given priority in redevelopment. And for larger housing estates, we must plan early and ahead. Otherwise, 10 years down the road, this will become an even more thorny issue. With these remarks, I support the motion by Mr. Man-kwong and Mr. Yang Wing-kit's amendment. Thank you.
Ms. Rebecca Chen. Thank you, Madam Deputy. Housing issue has been a long-standing problem in Hong Kong. Before capping the amount, as mentioned in the policy address, over the past few years, the waiting time has been ever longer. On average, new applicants have to wait for 6 years. That is only the average, and there are many people who have been waiting for more than 6 years. Many of these applicants are currently living in inadequate housing like caged housing units or subdivided units. And also, we cannot neglect those people living in old housing estates. They do have a roof over their head, but because of aging building and facilities, inconveniences are caused to them. In the new policy address, the chief executive mentioned that housing issue is still the top policy priority of the government. Besides enhancing speed, quantity, and quality, among these, quality is very important. That's why guidelines are set so that new public housing units built can create a sense of gain and a sense of happiness for residents. Of course, being allocated with a flat is a good thing, but what about improving living conditions for those already living in old housing estates? Now, the Housing Authority has conducted assessments on redevelopment potential for housing estates aged 42 to 70 years old. There are only redevelopment projects in line for Mata White Estate and several other estates. For the remaining dozen of housing estates, the redevelopment plans are still nowhere in sight. With the ever longer waiting list for PRH, the government has to focus its efforts in identifying sites to build public housing estates to alleviate the pressure on the waiting list. If the government is to engage in major redevelopment projects, decanting sites have to be identified, and there will be a short-term shock. However, the old housing estates are getting older, and there are many structural issues, for example, concrete spalling, water seepage. For some housing estates, there are not even lifts. It would cause harm to the safety of the residents living there, and with the passage of time, the problem would only get worse. If we are to demolish estates and rebuild them, it may take 10 years or longer. The governments really need to take action in advance before the problem is out of control. Now, in situ rehousing is a major issue. These old public housing estates are mostly located in urban area, and it is very difficult to find decanting sites nearby. For example, Choi Hong Estate, which is 60 years old, has a new public housing projects nearby in construction. Because of different reasons, the new public housing estates is not being used as a decanting site for the residents affected. The government really needs to urge the Housing Authority to set aside some units in new public housing estates for rehousing residents affected by redevelopment projects. The government simply cannot solely rely on building new PRH to address the waiting time for people. If you look at the results in the past 10 years, the answer is clear that it is insufficient. And also, for many old buildings, the plot ratio and building heights are not maximized. The units are small in size. The government should redevelop these public housing estates in phases so that land resources can be freed up and people can get better housing. And also, the government should make plannings early and adopt a standardized design and take the concept of allied public housing and provide for provisional or interim housing for residents affected in the urban area to speed up redevelopment. I support the motion and the amendments. Mr. Ben Chen. President, we have always paid close attention to this topic, but this is the first time that we have a standalone discussion on this. Now, the oldest public housing buildings are 70 years old, and there are many problems with such old buildings. So there are 22 housing estates which are, for housing estates aged 40 to 70 years old, there are 22 and 19 of these 22 housing estates would be redeveloped, and 19 would be renovated and 3 would be redeveloped. Now these 22 housing estates have wholesale ownership, and actually there are many housing estates with splitted ownership. In year 2025, you have started investigation. The first cycle has been completed, and then there will be the next cycle for year 2018 to 32. There will be the second cycle of investigation, and you will check the structural integrity and safety of the buildings. But that's only one aspect. There are facilities which are outdated and are not cost effective. For example, in my constituency, that is a Changheng estate, I receive a lot of complaints about water supply, in unstable water supply, and also broken pipes. Every month there are disruptions to water supply, and it is really a big nuisance. So I just want to say that besides structural safety, there are a whole lot of other problems. So the government is using 10-year or 5 years as a cycle to renovate and maintain old buildings. Well, 5 years may be too long for older buildings under the total maintenance scheme. For buildings which are located in near the sea with a high humidity, these buildings would experience more serious structural problems. So would the government perform more in-depth investigation and maintenance with a shorter cycle for these buildings? Now the construction cycle is very tense, and we are trying to catch up with the shortage of housing supply. It seems that redevelopment is not feasible at this stage, but we cannot neglect redevelopments and only focus on building new buildings. It seems that the government has always been reluctant to perform redevelopments. So over all these years, only 3 housing estates have been redeveloped. It would not be the case if the government has taken some early planning and announced housing estates up for redevelopment in advance. Then people would be notified and can make planning ahead. The case now is that there is a lack of a specific concrete timetable of housing estates up for redevelopments in the pipeline. With early planning, we can also secure the sites required to make in situ rehousing possible. There are sites where we can start a site formation and preliminary preparation to prepare for in situ rehousing. Site formation needs time, but in the years past, we were too slow. So I support the motion today. With redevelopment, we can address the housing issues while focusing on building new PRH as well. Now, residents are very worried, and sometimes they are desperate and they don't see any hope. So I hope the government can consider their plight. Mr. Lee Jin-kang. Thank you, President. According to the information provided by the Electrical Secretariat, there are some 1,900,000 units managed by the Housing Authority, and 25% of them are aged over 30 years old, and there are 28% aged 20 to 30 years old. So 140,000 units were completed between 1952 to 79. So some of them are even 70 years old. For these old buildings, there are lots of problems, including aging facilities, concrete spalling, ceiling falling down, drainage pipes damage, or even reflux of waste or dirt. So it seems that the residents are caught at a bad place. Redevelopment is a formidable task because we have to think about decanting or rehousing the residents. There are elderly people and there are young people among the residents. For younger people, they may be asked to move into smaller buildings, and some elderly people are unwilling to move. As a result, redevelopment is very challenging. And also, redevelopment projects would lengthen the waiting time for people waiting for the first allocation. Now 6 years is only the average waiting time. There are some 100,000 non-elderly single persons. These people have been waiting for the longest. They have been waiting for 7 to 10 years. As at the end of year 2022, there are some 250,000 people waiting for the first allocation. So it already accounts for 41% of the people, of the applicants. Now, in the long run, we should set aside a land to build housing units with better parameters and also enhance maximize the efficiency of land use. Of course, that is all very good, but that would be for the long run. In the short run, we should improve the living condition of PRH tenants. Now, for the time being, redevelopment may be the way to go. In the long run, the government should ensure that there is sufficient land supply for everyone. So there should be a multi-pronged approach, including reclamation, developing country parks periphery, using Chotong land, and also developing brownfield clusters. We welcome the government's approach to make use of the MIC building model to greatly speed up the supply of housing units. It will alleviate the wait as well as improving and speeding up redevelopment for old age building. The Liberal Party has been urging the government to enhance the public-private split under the partnership scheme to 60% to 40%. Through public-private partnership, there should be more infrastructure support and also a better utilization of land. We should speed up releasing the potential of private land to increase housing supply in the medium to long run. On the 1st of July, President Xi mentioned in his speech that the greatest aspiration of Hong Kong people is to live better and larger. That's why housing supply is definitely the top priority of this term of the government. The Housing Bureau should devise different options to address the problem, including planning in advance so as to meet people's aspiration. I so submit. Thank you.
Ms. Dari Lee, President, just now I was listening intently of the speeches made by members. All in all, speeding up the redevelopment pace of old housing estate is a key area. The government should increase the efficiency and speed of their plans. When we see that it takes ages for old housing estates to be redeveloped, we can see that the emphasis of the government is not on redevelopment of old housing estates. Of course, the secretary will not admit to that. She would probably say that everything is being planned. But compared to other projects, redevelopment of old housing estates seems to have taken a completely different pace. We see that huge amount of resources in terms of land resources, manpower resources are required in redevelopment. On top of that task, the government wants to shorten waiting time. They have come up with the idea of light public housing, and I'm sure that a priority would be accorded to shortening waiting time. And, well, apart from all these, there is also assistance to people who are living in inadequate housing, say, for example, subdivided units. Of course, we all admit that housing estates above the age of 40 to 60 years are in a poorer condition. But these are not the worst. Well, this is a new era. We have to think outside the box. If you use the same work approach, same mentality, given the current capacity, it will be very difficult to speed up the development of old housing estates if you are to increase efficiency and quantity. But you can find ways to release more capacity in construction. Say, well, for example, there are areas with a very strong view for redevelopment in old areas. The URA has come up with different redevelopment plans. Say, for example, in Kowloon City, you redeveloped Mata White Estate, you can use Lockman Estate to use the site for redevelopment. So if the negotiation goes well, then you can adopt this approach to work with the URA. I asked the Secretary to speed up the conventional approach, using Kowloon City, my constituency, as an example. Mata White Estate, Tianxin Meichun, and they're all they're like 60 and 57 years old. With the closure of the old airport, there is no height restrictions anymore. And in 2018 and 2021, the government has announced the redevelopment plan. An announcement might have been made, but everything stays the same. There are no details, so people are still waiting. So the government should speed up the announcement and the planning. In 2018, in the policy address, there was an announcement about redevelopment of Tianxin Meichun. But we have no details. We don't know when it will be completed. You said there is a site at Kai Tak in 2026 and 27 clearance will start. Of course, residents will welcome that because they can move to Kai Tak. Another estate is Mata White Estate. You came to the district council saying that there is a small site that could be used for rehousing individual blocks. But it will drag on the redevelopment plan. Why don't you simply find a bigger site to rehouse the residents there? There is such a site at Kai Tak. Then you can demolish a Mata White Estate and then move the residents of another estate to that site. This is a new era. Make use of different approaches.
Does any other member wish to speak? Mr. Scott LEUNG, you may now speak on the amendment. Thank you, President. First of all, I thank Mr. Hon Yang for moving his amendments. I also thank the 24 members who have spoken on my motion. Their views were invaluable. I will now speak on the amendments. Now, the Housing Authority and the Housing Society have a number of old age public housing estates under the belt. Aging is a serious problem. Redevelopment is needed for improvement of living standard. the housing authority and housing society continue to build public housing estates for people with lower income. The government has been increasing supply of public housing units to alleviate the waiting time. As a result, there is less resources for redevelopment purposes. I support that the government should enhance the supply of resources through land replacements and in situ rehousing to offer more options. Say, for example, the land available for housing authority and housing society to build PRH is from the government. There have been collaboration between the two societies and the authority, but there has been no arrangements like land replacement. For example, Mr. Kissin Yang mentioned the old housing estates in Kowloon City. Chunsi Mei Chun will be moved to site 1E in Kai Tak. Of course, there are other replacement and decanting options. After the decanting or rehousing process, the site can be used for the redevelopment of Mata Wai Chun. And then the original sites of Mata Wai Chun can be used for decanting residents in Lokman Chun. Such arrangements can speed up the time required for redevelopment projects. And also there can be exchanges of units between housing society and housing authority for redevelopment purposes, so that more redevelopment projects can take place. Now, the rehousing policies has a boundary based on the district council's area. I think there can be a better coordination, so that even if residents have to move to other districts, they can keep the old people human resources network and adapt to the new districts faster. And also, land resources and housing resources in the vicinity of projects should be used first to help the affected residents. I also support that what other members have suggested, that more incentives should be offered by the government to encourage in situ rehousing. President, I support the amendments moved by Mr. Kissin Yang. Thank you.
Secretary for Housing. President, I thank Mr. Man-kwong and Mr. Yang Wing-kit, as well as members who have spoken, expressing their concern on the redevelopment of old public housing estates. They have given me their valuable input. At the beginning, I have already spoken in relation to redevelopment policy, redevelopment timetable, improvement of buildings in old estates, as well as redevelopment plan of housing society. In my concluding remark, I will focus on topics touched on by members. First of all, I'd like to thank members for giving us their views. This will serve as reference for our work in the future. Members talk about our redevelopment work and wonder whether we have forgotten completely about redevelopment. In the policy address, there are many initiatives relating to housing. I myself and my colleagues in the Housing Authority have spent a lot of our efforts to identify ways to build new estates. But members are right in pointing out that we should not forget about redevelopment projects. We have proposed 10 such projects. I would like to briefly give you information about the work. Say for Pak Tin Estate and Mei Tong Estate, the work has completed. The work of Wah Fu Estate has commenced. That is the land formation, the site formation. For other estates, we have put we have a plan for rehousing. We think that for the first phase, population intake will start in 2017 and 28 for Shek Lei interim housing and the Shek Lei Catholic Primary School. The planning application has been approved by the Town Planning Board at the beginning of October. We will be able to churn out 1,700 units. We're now working on rehousing. There are 4 factory estates. They are Shui Fai Factory Building, Wang Chang Factory Estate, as well as a Yip On Factory Estate. The redevelopment plan are in progress. We have to take care of 2,100 tenants. I would like to thank the housing authority for their work. For Kwai On Factory Estate, planning application has been approved. We think that in the 4th quarter of this year, it will be gazetted. When we have resumed ownership of these factory estates, we will start decontamination and demolition before we start redevelopment. For Saiwan Estate and Mata White Estate, the consultancy study is being conducted at full steam. I would like to let you know that in the policy address you might find numerous projects to increase our speed and quantity, and that there will be a huge volume of public housing units produced in the coming 10 years. We have not forgotten the need for redevelopment of old housing estates. It's just that we have taken a pragmatic approach to tackle limitations in resources and manpower. We try to strike a balance. Members have given us a lot of concrete ideas, say for example doing it by phases, making use of existing sites within the estate. Members talk about standalone buildings, the use of vacant sites in the vicinity, or identifying larger sites for rehousing. These are our existing strategies. It's exactly because we have to do it by phases, and the fact that there are numerous residents living in these estates. Each household has their own needs. DHA has used a lot of resources and spent a lot of efforts to take care of their needs. The objective is to make sure that redevelopment will be conducted smoothly. What I'm trying to say is that when we consider redevelopment, we have to take into account all the factors. Before the policy address was delivered, departments and the chief executive have already had a full discussion of all the different factors, and we'll continue with our work. Aging condition of the buildings is also close to our heart. Members have cited examples. Some of them are old examples. It reminds us that we have to be mindful of repair and maintenance of buildings on a day-to-day basis. If you come across any cases, please don't hesitate to forward them to us for follow-up action. Aging conditioned of buildings would cause higher resources devotion. In cases when it's no longer cost-effective to conduct repair, we would accord priority for redevelopment. In terms of preventive repair, we have the comprehensive structural investigation program. We will consider making use of technology to identify problems and find solutions as soon as possible. And these are areas that we will work on. What I'd like to say is that we are all concerned about redevelopment of old housing estates. We might have devoted a lot of efforts on construction of new estates, and there is also the light public housing. In the coming 5 years, we have a heavy workload. But we'll continue to monitor the condition of old housing estates. We were our core priorities. It's not something that we would forget to do. I'd like to thank members for their suggestions. We'll continue with our work on maintenance and redevelopment of housing estate. I so submit.
Yang Wing-kit.
I now call upon Mr. Kit Yang to move an amendment. President, I move my amendment. I propose the question to you that Mr. Kit Yang's amendments be passed. I now put the question to you as stated. With those in favor, please raise their hands. Those against, please raise their hands. I think the question is agreed by a majority of each of the two groups of members present. I declare the amendments passed. Mr. Man-kwong, you still have 1 minute and 7 seconds to reply, and the debate will come to a close. Mr. Man-kwong. Thank you, President. I thank members for speaking in support of my motion to promote the redevelopment of aged public housing estates. Many members have said that since the 2013 assessment project, only a few housing estates are having redevelopment projects. The pace is too slow. But we are happy to hear that the government hasn't forgotten about redevelopment projects. And also, we support the Housing Authority to set a reasonable timetable based on the 4 principles. Now, I remember I'm deeply impressed by the saying that there are always more solutions than problems. Let's pool our resources together to help the government speed up a project housing unit supply. Let's work together to enhance the sense of gains for people. Thank you. I put the question to you that Mr. Scott Leung's motion as amended by Mr. Kit Yang be passed. With those in favor, please raise their hands. Those against, please raise their hands. I think the question is agreed by a majority of the two groups of members present. I declare the motion as amended passed. I now declare that the Council is adjourned until 11 a.m. Wednesday, 16th of November.